Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to the Galactic Archives. I'm Mesla. If you're new here, this channel is a home for long-form storytelling, deep lore, and the quiet work of building worlds that feel lived in. Storytime is very much at the heart of all of that. It is one of the main ways that I share the stories that live here on this channel, and one of the ways that I invite people into this world. A great deal of what I write is rooted in an ongoing Star Wars world, Star Wars fanfiction universe that has grown over many years, one chapter, one thread, and one piece of history at a time. So when we gather here for story time, we're not only opening a single chapter or story, we're stepping into a much larger world, one shaped by memory, culture, language, duty, grief, love, history, and all the quiet details that give a story weight. That's one of the things that I really love about long form storytelling. It allows the world to deepen around us. Give me 1 second. Sorry. It allows the world to deepen slowly. It lets characters change over time and lets relationships gather history. It lets lore become something more than just simply background details, and it becomes part of the emotional structure of the story itself, part of what the people carry, and part of what they inherit, and what gives meaning to the choices that they make. And that's very much what the archives are meant to be. We're not only a channel, but a shared space. A place to linger in a story and to spend time with the people, the histories, and the worlds that unfold here. Whether you've been following me for a while, or you're just arriving, you're welcome here. Sorry. Alright. Also, I do apologize if there's a bit of camera sync lag. I'm having a bit of issues with that this evening, so just as a heads up, that's a thing. Not sure why that is, but it's a thing this evening. Tonight, we will be reading chapter 23 from Steps into the Past, titled Through the Veil's Hold. Alright. And for those of you who may be lurking, I appreciate you. Hope you enjoy the story. Alright. Okay. Good evening, Shay. How are you? I think I'm without a mod so far this evening, but welcome. I understand that. I hope you're staying cool. I hope everybody is staying cool. It's mid-June, and depending on where you live, that can be ridiculous. All right, my friends. I'm just getting myself situated here. I know, right? Florida's probably ridiculous right now. I do not envy you. I'm just going to give you guys a little bit of a heads up that there is not an awful lot of dialogue in this chapter. It's really more a chapter kind of filled with, I guess, exposition is the right word. Because it kind of links everything up to this point into the rest of the story. So there's a lot of exposition and not a lot of actual dialogue in the story. Well, technically there's dialogue, but it's not what you would normally expect. You'll understand here in a minute. All right. Sorry, I'm getting myself situated. Prompter is being cranky. So, I am back to reading from the actual document. Apologies. Promise I haven't lost my voice yet. Yet, being the keyword. Okay. Steps into the Past, Chapter 23. Through the Veil's Hold. Silent bearing. Catane Fleet Yard's veil-secured hangar to the Wurda. The hangar's overhead lighting cast a cold, steady wash across the deck, illuminating every meter of plating in stark clarity and leaving no shadows for anyone to hide within. The Fleet Yards never truly slept. Even now, beyond the secured corridor, service crews moved between berths, cargo handlers guided freight containers toward transports, and technicians worked beneath the skeletal framework of half-disassembled vessels. Yet within the narrow lane granted to those with veil authority, the usual rhythm of the yard seemed distant, muted by design and by necessity. The Wurda rested on her landing gear at the far end of the secured hangar. Her hull absorbed more light than it reflected, the matte plating reducing glare beneath the overhead illumination. The engines hummed at a low, restrained idle, her thrust coils balanced just on the edge of full wake. The sound was soft enough to be overlooked by most people, but those accustomed to ships felt it immediately. It resonated faintly through the deck and into the chest, a quiet promise that the vessel was prepared to depart the instant her crew decided that it was time. Ethan Bevan stood waiting at the foot of the boarding ramp. His black armor gleamed dully beneath the muted lighting, the helmet clipped to his belt rather than sealed over his head. He'd been standing there longer than necessary. Nobody had ordered him to remain at the ramp. Nobody would have questioned him if he'd waited aboard. Yet there had been no place else that he was willing to be while the transfer remained unfinished. His posture was calm, controlled, almost motionless, yet it carried the unmistakable weight of a man deliberately holding himself steady. The slightest shift in his stance betrayed the moment he spotted movement at the far end of the secure corridor. One shoulder settled, and his weight was distributed evenly across both feet. To anyone unfamiliar with him, it would have meant nothing. To a Marine like Greer, it was obvious. He was bracing for what mattered. The escort column emerged from the corridor a few moments later. The sealed Emberlock pod floated at its center. The anti-grav systems engaged only enough to remove the burden of its mass without sacrificing control. Vec kept both hands on the guide rails, making minute, constant corrections as the pod crossed the seams in the deck plating. Greer's dominant hand brushed once, low along the outside of his thigh, while his upper body subtly angled away from the pod, and the line adjusted their pace by instinct. No verbal cue needed. Arc, guard. Maintain discipline and awareness. They all knew what it represented. The pod itself revealed absolutely nothing. Its durasteel composite shell remained smoothed and unbroken, the upper section sealed completely over the shrouded form within. No V-port offered a glimpse of the occupant. There were no external readouts displaying medical data, no indicator light suggesting life or death. To an outside observer, it could have contained anything. That was precisely the point. Greer walked at the formation's forward edge. One hand remained near the recessed control panel built into the pod's side, his fingers occasionally brushing the surface in a motion that appeared casual to anyone unfamiliar. But it was not casual. He was not merely checking the pod's status. He already knew the condition. The motion existed for a different reason entirely. Anyone reaching for the controls would have encountered his hand first. Behind Vec was Callista. She remained close enough to reach the pod immediately if something changed, yet far enough back to avoid interfering with movement. Her expression was composed, as experienced healers learn to be when circumstances demanded calm from everyone around them. Even so, tension lingered around her eyes. The strain had been there for days now, appearing and disappearing in small moments whenever she thought no one was looking. To either side of the pod, Harris and Raoul maintained security positions. Their eyes swept the hangar continuously, neither hurried nor complacent. There was a difference between looking and seeing, and both men had spent enough years in uniform to understand both instinctively. Talon moved within the escort, with the quiet economy of a senior Marine who understood his presence was not meant to draw attention. He did not crowd Greer's authority or interrupt the movement of the column. He held his place, watched the angles, and let the formation do what it had been designed to do. Jared occupied the rear. That placement was deliberate. No one had assigned it, and nobody needed to. He was among the most capable combatants present. His awareness extended beyond ordinary observation, sharpened by years of Jedi training and instincts he rarely spoke about. More importantly, the rear position allowed him to watch every approach vector the rest of their formation could not easily see. It allowed him to stand between the pod and any threat emerging from behind. It allowed him to keep the oath that he had never voiced aloud. His gaze moved steadily across the corridor behind them, occasionally returning to the pod itself before sweeping outward again. To anyone watching, he appeared calm. Inside, however, the weight of what they carried remained impossible to ignore. Marin was only a few meters away, close enough that he could have rested a hand against the pod's hull if he chose, close enough that the reality of her survival felt tangible. And yet the circumstances surrounding that survival had placed her farther beyond reach than she had ever been before. Sorry. The pod represented far more than injury. It represented Drakenwell, and the lie that now was woven through every level of the operation. It represented the terrible necessity that had forced people he trusted to convince the galaxy that she was dead. The escort continued across the hangar. As they approached the Wurda, Ethan's attention moved across the formation one person at a time. Greer, Talon, Harris, Ral, Vec, Callista, and Jared. Then his gaze settled on the pod and remained there. For a brief moment, the hangar seemed to contract around the single object. He remembered a little girl who had stolen her way aboard a freighter. He remembered the teenager who challenged every authority figure she encountered. He remembered training sessions, arguments, victories, failures, and the countless small moments that had accumulated into something far closer to family than either of them had ever openly admitted. Now she arrived aboard his ship, sealed inside a pod beneath Emerlock authority while the galaxy believed that she was dead. The thought tightened something deep in his chest, though he gave no outward sign of it. They crossed the threshold into the Wurda's shadow, the ramp's plating vibrating faintly beneath their boots as the ship's system adjusted to the added load. Ethan stepped aside just enough to let them pass, his brown eyes flicking over each of them before landing on the pod and staying there. Greer's hand lowered, palm down near his thigh as though settling something out of sight. Conceal asset. Keep the pod secure. Ethan's answering gesture was a single restrained nod while his thumb pressed once against the side of his index finger. Acknowledged. I have the watch now. This was quickly followed by Ethan's thumb circling once, slowly, against the first joint of his index finger as if easing stiffness. The remaining fingers stayed relaxed while Ethan subtly angled himself toward the pod. Oops. Oh. That is not what I want us to do. Sorry. Watch, claim. Understood. She's mine now. This was not merely Ethan claiming responsibility for an Emberlock asset. He was specifically claiming responsibility for Marin. No further exchange was necessary. The lighting shifted almost immediately as the formation entered the hold. The harsher illumination of the fleet yards gave way to the warmer, muted tones of the warder's internal systems. Behind them, the outer hatch began to close. The heavy door sealed with a low, solid clunk, marking more than a physical barrier. For the first time since leaving the medical wing, the transfer existed entirely inside a controlled space. Only after the hatch was sealed did Ethan finally speak. Set her forward starboard, lock the pod buffer. His voice was quiet, steady, and entirely controlled. Vec guided the pod toward the designated berth. The anti-grav system lowered incrementally as magnetic guidance rails aligned with the transport cradle. Harris and Rowell maintained their security positions until the final moments of docking, neither relaxing their vigilance simply because they were aboard ship. The transport cradle locked into place with a soft magnetic hum. Callista was already moving before the buffer locks fully engaged. The instant the pod settled into position, she stepped forward and laid her hands against the sealed canopy. Her inspection was methodical, almost ritualistic in its precision. Environmental integrity, power continuity, medical support routing, structural stability. Everything reported exactly as it should. She checked it again anyway. Not because she doubted the readings. Not because she doubted the Marines. Because Marin was inside, and because after Bastine and Druckenwell, even certainty felt too precious to trust after a single glance. Only then did Harris and Rowell finally ease back from immediate escort posture. Greer remained where he was for another few moments. His attention moved across the compartment, performing one final sweep of the internal comnet and security status. There was no unauthorized traffic, no unexpected signals, and so far, no indications of compromise. Satisfied, he removed his hand from the pod. It was such a small motion that most people would never have noticed it, yet it marked the true end of the transfer. Only then did he set his gear down nearby and rest his carbine across his knees. Around him, the others gradually settled into the rhythm of a ship preparing for departure. The escort phase was over, and the watch had begun. The tension within the compartment didn't disappear. No one expected it to. Not after Druckenwell. Not after everything that had been required to bring Marin this far. But it changed. The sharp edge of the immediate danger had softened. The burden remained, but it shifted from movement to protection. To vigilance. The pod was securely within the warder's hold. Beyond the hull, the Catane fleet yards continued their endless cycle of departures and arrivals, oblivious to the truth hidden within a single secured vessel. Inside the hold, beneath the protection of the veil and the silence of those sworn to keep it, Marin Durza remained alive. For now. That was enough. And for the first time since leaving the medical wing, the people gathered around her allowed themselves the smallest measure of belief that they might actually reach the next stage of their journey. Sorry. Okay. I need water. The lift from Shadow. Aboard the Werda. The hold's seal indicator shifted from red to amber and then finally to green. The change was small, a simple sequence of lights above the hatch, but every person in the compartment noticed. For the first time since leaving the medical wing, there was a measurable distance between Marin and the dangers waiting beyond the fleet yards. Greer gave one final sweep of the compartment. Years of habit carried him through the motions automatically. Hatch, pod, personnel, sightlines, access points, communications, Nothing had changed since they'd come aboard, but that was never the point. The final sweep was not performed because he expected something new. It existed to ensure nothing had slipped through unnoticed. Satisfied, he briefly angled both palms outward near his waist as he widened his stance in front of the hatch. Perimeter seal. Hold is secure. She is protected. Ethan acknowledged the signal with a slight inclination of his head. His eyes lingered on the pod for a moment before shifting to the rest of the team. Maintain watch until we're clear. The order was simple. No one questioned it, and no one would have expected anything else from him. Vec moved first, taking a position along the forward bulkhead where he could monitor both the pod and the primary approach into the compartment from the corridor beyond. Raoul settled a short distance away, the two Marines establishing overlapping fields of observation without needing to even discuss it. Harris crossed toward the aft hatch and planted himself near the access point, his posture relaxed enough to appear casual while remaining ready to react the instant circumstances demanded it. Jared remained where he was, his attention lingering on the pod. The transfer was complete. The route was secure. They were aboard the Werda, yet some part of him still seemed reluctant to increase the distance, even by a few steps. Eventually, he settled against the bulkhead closest to the pod, positioning himself so that he could maintain visual contact with it while keeping both entrances in view. It was not a Marine security position, but it served much of the same purpose. He could see the compartment, the approaches, and Marin all at once. Nearby, Gunnery Sergeant Corin Tillon settled near the edge of the hold. Like Greer, he occupied a position that appeared entirely unremarkable to an outsider. Years of casualty recovery operations had taught him how to become part of a perimeter without drawing attention. He watched the compartment quietly, neither inserting himself into Greer's responsibility or distancing himself from them. He was simply present, another experienced set of eyes added to the watch. Okay, 1 second. Okay. Only then did Greer finally remove his rifle from its sling. The weapon remained within easy reach as he settled into a loose crouch against the bulkhead. To anyone unfamiliar with the Marines, the posture might have looked relaxed, but it was not. It was the posture of a man prepared to remain exactly where he was for as long as necessary. Callista stood beside the pod with both hands resting lightly against the sealed shroud. The compartment had grown quieter now that the movement was over. Without the steady rhythm of boots, anti-grav systems, and escort coordination, the silence seemed larger somehow. She could feel it. Not through the Force, not in any mystical sense, simply through its absence. The stillness inside the pod pressed against her awareness in a way she couldn't quite explain. Marin had always seemed too alive to remain still for long. Too stubborn, too restless, and too determined to accept limitations imposed by anyone else. Now she lay sealed within layers of durasteel and medical support systems while half the galaxy believed she was dead. Callista's throat tightened. She forced the reaction back before it could gain momentum. There would be time for emotion, later. For now, she was still a healer. Her fingers moved across the transport housing one final time, checking status indicators she had already reviewed multiple times since boarding. Power levels, environmental stability, pod buffer integrity. Everything remained exactly as it should be. Across the compartment, Greer watched the motion. For a brief moment, their eyes met. He dipped his chin while his thumb pressed once against the side of his index finger. Acknowledged. Nothing has worsened. Ad starting now? My apologies, friends. Welcome back from the ad break, my friends. I didn't quite catch that, I'm sorry. I promise, I do try to pay attention to those. I'm gonna pick up right where we left off because I think it got cut off. Across the compartment, Greer watched her motions. For a brief moment, their eyes met. He dipped his chin while his thumb pressed once against the side of his index finger. Acknowledged. Nothing has worsened. Callista answered by pressing her fingertips lightly against the surface of the pod before releasing. Steady progress. The situation remains manageable. The signal remained what it had always been. The weight behind it had changed. Greer understood immediately. She was holding. Barely, perhaps, but holding. The Master Sergeant gave no outward response beyond the faintest shift of his posture. He didn't need to. Jared watched the exchange from beside the pod. The signals themselves were familiar enough by now, but what lingered with him was not the doctrine. It was the people behind it. He could see the strain that Callista carried despite her composure, and he could see the quiet understanding in Greer's response. Everyone aboard the Warder was carrying some version of the same burden. The details differed, but the weight did not. After another moment, Callista finally withdrew her hands from the pod. The motion felt strangely difficult, as though removing them made the distance more real. She turned and crossed toward the corridor leading to the cockpit, leaving the Marines and Jared to their watch. As she passed, Talon's gaze rested briefly on the pod. It was not long enough for anyone to call attention to it, but long enough. The memories arrived uninvited. A younger Jerry is standing beneath rain-soaked floodlights. A withdrawal route collapsing around them. Orders were barked through smoke and artillery impacts. There was a hand grabbing his armor and hauling him up right when he thought he could go no further. Talon blinked once and returned his attention to the compartment. The mission came first. Still, some part of him felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that the promise carried by the old unit had not ended with Jarius' death. Not then. Not now. Not ever. Hello, Wicked. Welcome in, my dear. How are you? The mission came... Oops, sorry. The corridor lights dimmed slightly as Callista entered the cockpit. The warder was already configured for departure. Consoles glowed softly throughout the compartment. Status indicators scrolled across displays. Power systems hums beneath the deck with the restrained confidence of a vessel prepared to leave at a moment's notice. Ethan sat in the pilot's chair. One hand rested against the throttle assembly while the other moved through pre-flight diagnostics with practiced efficiency. He looked up briefly when she entered, and the corner of his mouth lifted almost imperceptibly before his attention returned to the controls. Oops. That tiny expression said more... Oops. There we go. That tiny expression said more than most people realized. Callistus found herself smiling despite everything happening. She moved behind him and rested one hand against the back of the chair before leaning slightly into his space. The familiar scent of oil, dust, and armor greeted her immediately. Under normal circumstances, she might not have even noticed it. Tonight, it felt grounding, comforting, and real. Without looking away from the displays, Ethan's arm settled around her waist. The motion was completely instinctive. Neither of them seemed aware of it happening. It was simply where his hand belonged whenever she stood beside him. Callista closed her eyes briefly. For a moment, she allowed herself to lean into the contact. The steady thrum of the ship vibrated through the deck and into the chair beneath him. She could feel it through his shoulder, through his arm, and through the simple certainty of his presence. He was worried. He probably wouldn't say anything, but she could see it all the same. His attention kept drifting toward the hold status display. He had already checked the diagnostics more than once. Every movement carried the rigid control of someone determined not to let concern interfere with responsibility. I'm worried too. The words emerged quietly. They weren't a question or an accusation, simply a recognition. Ethan's hand tightened slightly around her waist. For several seconds he said nothing. The cockpit remained filled with the hum of systems and the distant sounds of departure preparation. When he finally spoke, his voice emerged as a low rumble. I'm just glad she's still in one piece. Mostly. Callista felt his exhale. The sound carried more weight than the actual words. I've been offering prayers to the lady since the day she left on deployment. The confession settled between them. Simple and entirely honest. Callista laced her fingers through his. And I think she heard you. For a moment, neither of them said anything more. The silence was not uncomfortable. The quiet crackle of the comm system finally interrupted it. A short, coded burst arrived from the Nighthawks confirming sweep complete, perimeter clear, and escort position established. Ethan squeezed her hand once before releasing it and returning his full attention to the controls. The moment passed, yet the responsibility remained. Callista touched his shoulder as she stepped away. I'll brew up some calf and be hot. We'll need it. That earned a faint snort from him, the closest thing to amusement he had managed all day. By the time she reached the narrow galley alcove, she felt the change beneath her feet. The warder's repulsors engaged with the low vibration that traveled through the hull. The sensation increased gradually as the ship lifted clear of the deck. A subtle shift in balance followed as Ethan guided the vessel away from its berth. Back in the hold, Jared felt the movement as well. Through the small viewport set into the inner hatch, he caught a final glimpse of the fleet yards beyond. The station lights drifted slowly across the darkness as the warder cleared her berth. He found himself looking back toward the pod once more before returning his attention to the compartment as a whole. The ship was moving, and the next stage had begun. Outside, the Nighthawks flared their thrusters and pivoted smoothly into escort formation. The fleet yards fell away behind them as the warder turned toward open space. Under Ethan's practiced hands, the ship accelerated into the darkness beyond the station, carrying its passengers, its secrets, and the fragile hope sealed within the hold away from the shadows of Drakadwell and into the uncertain road ahead. Oops. Sorry. I'm slouching. How are you doing tonight, Wicked? You doing alright? Forward hold, vigil, Werda, in transit to Tanagas 5. The forward hold remained wrapped in a quiet that felt almost sacred, broken only by the steady, low thrum of the Werda's drives and the faint hum of the pod's internal stabilizers. The sealed transport pod rested in its buffer frame along the starboard bulkhead, the Emberlock standard hardcase giving nothing away. No readouts glowed through the armored shell, no lights offered reassurance, and no viewport betrayed the figure hidden within. The solid upper shell had been locked in place back at the fleet yards, its matte surface catching only the muted wash of the hold's lights. And the pod simply existed as a sealed truth carried beneath the veil. Sorry. Jared sat with his back against the bulkhead beside it, one knee drawn slightly upward and his shoulder close enough to the hardcase that he could feel the faint vibration of the stabilization systems through the metal. One hand turned Jarius' original tags through his fingers with absent repetition, the chain whispering whenever the links shifted against one another. He rarely looked directly at the pod. He didn't need to. Its presence occupied the hold as surely as any living person. A weight in the air and an anchor beside him. Every so often his eyes drifted closed, not in sleep, but in the wary half-focus that came from refusing to lower his guard completely. His awareness stretched beyond the compartment itself, skimming corridors, hatches, movement, and silence alike. Training accounted for part of it. The rest belonged to a promise. Across the compartment, Harris, Ral, Vec, and Talon maintained a staggered watch rotation. They had settled into positions that allowed clear observation of both access points and the pod without creating the appearance of a formal perimeter. To an outsider, they might have looked like tired Marines occupying spare deck space during a long transit. Anyone who knew Marines would have recognized the truth immediately. Every approach lane remained covered. Every sightline remained accounted for, and nothing reached the pod unnoticed. They had been there since the beginning of the mission, just as they had been there on Tanagas after Bastine. The unspoken recognition between them and Jared did not need words. They remembered the first veil activation around Marin, the way the air itself seemed to change when the protocol locked in. They had been her shadows since, and now they guarded both her and the Jedi who refused to leave her side. Talon occupied the position nearest the forward hatch. Like Greer, he possessed a talent for appearing less alert than he truly was. Years spent conducting casualty recovery and rear security operations had refined the skill into instinct. He sat with his back against a bulkhead support, one forearm resting loosely across a raised knee, and his attention seemingly fixed on nothing in particular. In reality, he missed very little. His gaze drifted briefly toward Jared and the pod before moving away again, but the sight carried echoes he rarely allowed himself to dwell on. Another Durza. Another recovery. Another watch held through the long hours between danger and safety. He pushed the thoughts aside because the mission remained, and the oath bound him to that duty. For now, that was enough. The hatch cycled open with a muted hydraulic rumble. Every Marine in the compartment noticed, though none reacted visibly. Callista stepped through, carrying a large tray braced carefully against one forearm. 6 steaming bowls occupied most of its surface, accompanied by 6 mugs filled nearly to the brim. The scent reached the hold before she fully entered. Slow-cooked stew, fresh bread, and the familiar herbal sharpness of Behat cutting through the sterile atmosphere of the compartment. The smell alone was enough to remind everyone how long it had been since they'd eaten properly. She waited until the hatch sealed before speaking. "Food," she said simply, setting the tray down on the table near the port bulkhead. The single word carried more authority than any military order. Callista's blue eyes swept the compartment, moving across each member of the watch before settling on Jared. "One at a time. You first." Jared's gaze looked immediately toward the pod. The hesitation lasted only a heartbeat because Harris moved before he could even object. His thumb circled once slowly against the first joint of his index finger while he subtly angled his body toward the pod. "Watch claim. You can step away. You don't carry this alone." The signal was small enough that a non-cleared observer would have mistaken it for an idle movement. Jared did not. Neither did the rest of the watch. Almost immediately, Ral adjusted position by half a step, subtly redistributing coverage. Vec shifted his stance to maintain overlap. Talon's attention settled more firmly toward the compartment's hatch, and the formation tightened, without a word. Jared's jaw tightened, but the argument died before it could begin. He nodded once, rose, and crossed toward the bench along the bulkhead with the tag still wrapped around his hand. Callista passed him a bowl and mug without comment. The first sip of Behat was almost painfully hot, and he welcomed it anyway. Warmth spread through his chest and shoulders in slow waves, and only then did he realize how cold he'd become sitting beside the pod. He ate mechanically at first, more out of obligation than hunger. Gradually the rhythm slowed. The stew was simple but filling, and by the time the bowl was sat empty, some of the tension in his posture had eased. Not much, but enough for Callista to notice. Of course she did. She nudged the mug back toward him. "Drink all of it," she murmured, her voice pitched so low that it would not carry beyond him. Jared looked up, and for a moment he seemed ready to protest. and then he caught the expression on her face and thought better of it. By the time he returned to his place beside the pod, Vec was already stepping forward to collect his own meal. The rotation continued with the same smooth efficiency that characterized everything else about the watch. Jared settled back against the bulkhead, and his hand found the upper shell of the hard case almost unconsciously. The metal remained cool and smooth beneath his fingers. The tags dangled from his fingers once more, the chain catching briefly against old calluses before slipping free. The hatch opened again several minutes later, and this time Greer entered. His boots made almost no sound against the deck. But Callista noticed him immediately, so did Talon and every Marine in the compartment. Greer paused just inside the hatch, taking in the watch positions, the pod, the personnel, and the compartment itself. The motion was automatic, and Callista watched him perform it with the quiet assessment of someone who already knew the answer. The exhaustion showed if you knew where to look. Not in his posture and not in his eyes, but in the tiny delays between movements, the slower shifts of focus and the weight he carried without complaint. "Eat," she told him, sliding a bowl his way. Greer glanced toward the table and opened his mouth, but Callista raised a hand. "No." The words stopped him before the argument began. Several of the Marines exchanged carefully neutral expressions. Talon looked away entirely because experience had taught him this conversation was already over. "Then you're resting." No argument. Greer tried to counter with a faint shake of his head, but she stepped in just close enough for the quiet authority to land. 2, maybe 3 days now without sleep, she said softly. It was not a question. You're not at your best, and they need you at your best. Greer's gray eyes narrowed slightly. For several seconds, he seemed determined to continue resisting, and then he sighed. A quiet, long-suffering sound that carried more surrender than agreement. The Master Sergeant picked up the bowl. A few muttered words and Natashir followed under his breath, and Talon's mouth twitched while Jared looked suspiciously like he was trying not to smile. Callista chose not to acknowledge any of it. She simply waited until Greer finished eating. Only then did she place a folded blanket on the bench beside him and gesture to the bunk nearby. "Now," she said simply. The single word carried enough authority to make even Harris look mildly entertained. Greer stared at the blanket, then at her, and then back at the blanket. Eventually he surrendered and moved toward the bunk. Several minutes later his breathing had settled into a steady rhythm, the blanket drawn up nearly to his shoulders. The compartment somehow felt more relaxed for it, but not because anyone worried less, but because someone else was finally carrying part of the burden. Callista let him be and crossed back toward Jared. He remained awake, technically, though the distinction felt increasingly questionable. She crouched beside him and gently returned the tags to his hand after they had slipped partially from his grasp. And then she draped a lighter blanket around his shoulders. "Stay warm," she murmured, just loud enough for him to hear. Jared's eyes opened. For a moment they met hers, and then he nodded once. No further words were necessary. If he eventually drifted into sleep while leaning against the pod, nobody commented. Not Talon, not Harris, not Ral, and certainly not Vec. The watch continued. As the warder carried them steadily toward Tanagas, the shadows cast across the matte surface of the hard case shifted almost imperceptibly with the movement of the ship, marking the passage of time while those sworn to guard Maranderza kept their vigil. Wow, words are hard today. Oh, dear. Oh, okay. I'm slouching. Somebody please yell at me. That's what posture checks are for. I keep catching myself slouching, and I'm trying desperately not to. Okay. Wicked, are you claiming your cat for the day? I forgot to do that. Also, who was here first? That would have been MMO Radio. If somebody doesn't catch it first, you can snag the first. Thank you, Wicked. They need a good stretch. There is only one of those in the stream, so once somebody snags it, it's gone. Are you? I was just stretching, lady. Oh. Wow. Oh, I actually have a snack. Hold on. At least I think I do. I do. My snack today is fruit snacks. I know. Alright. I love fruit snacks, man. They're like my thing. And honestly, I like them a lot better than sitting there and eating like Oreos or something. I am actually trying to lose weight. I promise. So if I'm gonna sit there and eat stuff, fruit snacks are probably one of the less ridiculous things that I could eat. I'm not kidding, I actually buy them by the box. I'm not even joking. Like, you can buy them on Amazon for like a box of, what is it? The box I get on Amazon has like 40 of them in it. It's like, I don't know, $8. I mean, sometimes I buy Oreos too. It really depends on my mood at at any point in time, but what I had on hand was fruit snacks, so I will have to replenish my stream snacks when I get paid. You know, reasons. Alright. Give me a little more water. Yes. Yeah, you guys can feel free to play with any of the commands on the stream, whether they're sound alerts or commands. Yeah. I alternate between like Oreos, fruit snacks, Pirate's Booty, like the white cheddar ones. That's kind of what I rotate between. It really depends on what I have. So. But yes, as far as commands go, there's a whole bunch of new ones. And there is also some sound alerts. Some of them are bits, some are channel points. Yes. That's a cute emote. I know, sorry. No, mine says it starts in 4.5 minutes. Oh. Lady. My timer says it starts in just over 4 minutes. No ads. There should not be an ad, I don't think. Yeah, I don't have a command for ads. But I don't think there should be an ad. We've got like just under 4 minutes according to the timer, I think. Unless the Twitch timer is lying to me, which it could be. We'll see. Oh, it's okay. I'm glad you're here tonight, because I think you're the only mod in the room, but that's okay. It's all good. I'm just glad somebody's here to hang out with the rest of us. Hey, you gotta take care of real life first. It's not gonna upset me any. Real life is important. Alrighty. Coast under cloak. Patani border territories. Tanagas system. The void outside the Werda stretched dark and star-filled around them as the ship moved under cloak toward Tanagas. Ethan had activated the system the moment they cleared Kira's magnetic envelope. Word of Ghostfire stamped, keyed, and accepted before the freighter vanished into its concealed flight profile. In the cockpit, the instruments were dimmed to night mode, their soft amber and blue light reflecting from Ethan's armor and the controls beneath his hands. He flew with precision, matching the escort's offset boxes through encrypted cues while the low sound of compressors, attitude gyros, and the environmental systems settled beneath the deck. Blackhawk 9, Werda, Ethan murmured, his voice pitched low enough not to disturb the quiet they were preserving throughout the ship. Forwarding the colony grid and perimeter buoys. Recommend you start with the southern blind arcs. The colonists shored them up after the last incursion, but the treeland scatters returns. As he listened for the acknowledgement, Ethan lifted his left hand from the throttle. His thumb brushed once along the side of his index finger while his hand remained low and still, and he angled subtly toward Callista where she leaned near the co-pilot's chair. Silence maintained. Keep this calm. Let her rest. Also, for anybody who's curious, that is the invented manual gesture language that I call Veil Code. It's kind of like combat sign language to a degree, but it's kind of a little more covert, if you will. I appreciate it. Callista caught the motion immediately, and her chin dipped once. The signal required no further explanation. The circle remained closed. Communications remained controlled, and nothing unnecessary would pass beyond those already carrying the burden. Nine's reply came back tight and professional. 9 copies. We'll stay with you to the rendezvous, then break to pattern. The escort returned to its patrol, trusting the Mandalorian freighter's vector, while the Werda continued toward Tanagas beneath the cloak. Callista left Ethan in the cockpit and moved aft through corridors washed in soft amber light. The ship sounded steady around her, with heat exchangers ticking deep in the hull, relays clicking beyond the bulkheads, and ventilation moving quietly through sealed ducts. In the galley, she filled several insulated mugs from kettles that had been prepared earlier in the flight. I'm gonna stop right there because we're about to be in an ad, my friends. Please go get yourself some water or a snack. That is really important, even for me. See you in a minute and a half. Alright, my friends, welcome back from jail. I apologize for that. Unfortunately, there's not much I can do about those. They're a thing. Alright. Ah, yes. Here we are. Yes, welcome back. I'm gonna go back one sentence just in case anybody missed it. In the galley, she filled several insulated mugs from kettles that had been prepared earlier in the flight. No meals were needed this time. What remained was the long watch between departure and arrival. And warm hands stayed alert more easily than cold ones. Steam curled upward as she arranged the mugs on a tray. Yo! Obi-Wan Jacoby, sir, welcome in. Good to see you. It's been a hot minute. Thank you for that watch streak. Awesomeness. Thank you for that. I appreciate you, sir. It's good to see you. When she entered the forward hold, little had changed. The sealed pod rested in its transport cradle along the starboard bulkhead, its Emberlock standard hard case giving nothing away. There were no external readouts or status lights. The internal antigrav was cold for the moment, with only a low reserve hum beneath the casing to indicate that the system remained ready. It's been a hot minute. I hope you're well. Harris and Rowell held a position near the hatch, their positions giving them clear control over the primary approach into the hold. Beck occupied the inner angle near the pod's forward end, where he could monitor both the cradle locks and the line of movement that would matter once they landed. Talon sat slightly forward of the formation, but near enough to the main hatch to serve as an additional rear security anchor while maintaining sightlines across the compartment. Years of casualty recovery operations had taught him how to remain still without becoming inattentive, and his attention moved patiently between the hatch, corridor, personnel, and the pod. Lord, sir! Good to see you too, my friend. Everybody's here today, thank you. All kinds of people that I haven't seen in a while. Jared remained seated beside the pod with his shoulder against the bulkhead, and Jarius Durza's original tags threaded through his fingers. His duty lay in the awareness he could maintain beyond the visible compartment, in the thin, disciplined arc of perception that touched the corridor, the hull, the breathing rhythm of the watch, and the quiet presence sealed within the pod. He did not press his awareness toward Marin. He kept the space clear and guarded the edges no sensors could fully read. Near the port bulkhead, Greer slept in one of the narrow fold-down bunks beneath the blanket Callista had given him earlier. The sight still seemed unusual enough that no one commented. He had pushed himself too far, and the fact that he could sleep at all meant the watch was holding. No one disturbed him. They had no intention of doing so. Callista handed out the mugs without ceremony. Jared accepted his with a nod, breathing in the herbal heat of the beehot before wrapping both hands around it. Talon inclined his head when she passed him a mug, and then returned his attention to the hatch. Vec murmured a quiet thanks. Harris and Rowell took theirs without abandoning their posts, shifting only enough to drink and keeping their watch posture. The party in here. One second. A few minutes later, Greer stirred in the bunk. He did not rise at first, only opened his eyes and adjusted to the compartment with the reflexive awareness of a man who never woke all at once, unless danger demanded it. His gaze moved over the pod, the watch positions, and the people in the hold before settling briefly on Jared. Without speaking, he lifted one hand close to his body. His hand rocked once at waist level and the edge of his palm angled toward the pod. Silent query. Has anything changed that requires action? Jared answered in the same quiet language. His left hand rose from his knee and settled briefly against the pod. His fingers curled once and released before he lowered his hand again. Stabilized. Monitoring. Condition is stable. Harris's right index finger tapped lightly once against his thigh before settling. Observe, only. Maintain stillness and discipline. Raoul's hands remained low near his waist as his palms angled outward and his stance widened slightly. Perimeter seal. The protective circle is holding. Vec's knuckles pressed briefly against his thigh. His hand remained still for one breath before easing back to neutral. Continue current watch posture. The answers satisfied Greer. He shifted enough to sit more upright in the bunk, but he didn't leave it. Sleep had roughened his voice when he finally spoke, though it hadn't weakened his authority. Blackhawks will break at the ridge, Greer said finally. We keep the pod sealed until we're inside and secure. No one argued. Every person in the compartment already knew the route from the ship to the estate. Pod, ramp, corridor, threshold, and final seal. Harris, Rao, kit checks now, final tie-down on landing. Vec, you and Talon stay on the cradle locks until we're through the threshold. Oops, sorry. Harris adjusted his gauntlets, poked 2 fingers through his rifle sling, and gave it a measured test. Raoul crouched briefly to inspect his pack straps and mag catch, and then checked the tightness of the fastenings by touch. Vec ran one gloved hand along the pod's lower seam, reading the casing through pressure and alignment. Talon shifted from his forward security position long enough to confirm the opposite lock housing, and then returned enough of his attention to the hatch to keep the approach covered. Jared remained where he was, continuing the quieter work of monitoring the edges beyond sight. A soft tone from the speaker mounted to the bulkhead, one of Ethan's private cues rather than a general ship alert. Callista looked up as Ethan's voice came over the internal comm in the same low tone that he'd used with the escort. Crossing in the outer markers. Cloak steady. Nighthawk sliding to their pattern in 30. Copy, Greer replied. He drew a breath and then lifted his hand where the watch could see it. 2 fingers brushed diagonally across his belt and then settled vertically against his thigh before his hand relaxed. Twin edge shift. Continue current protective posture through landing. The watch tightened. Jared let the tags lie heavy in his palm again. In a gesture so small that almost no one saw it, he set them to rest against the curve of the pod's upper shell. The motion had nothing to do with the Force, Veil Code, or even Veil Doctrine. It was simply contact offered where contact had been denied. He left them there for a moment, then 2 before easing them back into his hand and settling once more against the bulkhead. Callista crossed to the recess control panel and touched them in a sequence to wake the pod's internal repulsors. No external readouts came alive. Emberlog Doctrine permitted no such display. A subtle shift in the field tension moved beneath her wrist as the anti-grav coil shifted to standby. Oops. Sorry. There we go. 3 minutes, Ethan said. The word answered with a barely perceptible pitch change as he began bleeding velocity. In the hold, no one moved more than necessary. Tension remained present, but it was disciplined and contained. Harris checked his shoulder harness, then his fingers settled briefly against the pod before drawing inward in a short, controlled line as he oriented toward Ral. Recovered property. Internal seal. The pod is secured and prepared for movement. Ral mirrored the confirmation, and then his index and middle finger swept once in a shallow, concealed curve against it along his belt as though adjusting it. His posture remained neutral. Shadow route. The planned movement path remained secure. Vec checked the cradle locks again and then rested his hand on the forward rail. Talon shifted his stance to cover both the pod and the hatch approach. Sorry. Jared leaned his head back against the bulkhead and let his eyes half close, keeping his awareness measured and restrained. Within the sealed pod, Marin's presence remained distant, shielded yet alive. Oops. Outside, Synagus turned beneath its cover of forest and mist while the Nighthawks peeled away to sweep the colony grid and its blind arcs. Inside the Wurda, every duty had found its proper place. Weapons were checked, the route was confirmed, and the veil remained intact. 2 minutes, Ethan said. Oops. Greer sat fully upright in the bunk and looked across the compartment once, confirming every position. His hand remained low and close to his body as his index and middle finger straightened briefly, and then relaxed again in a restrained downward motion. Proceed. Maintain discipline throughout the final approach. No one looked directly at the pod when the buried ready diode gave its soft, concealed glow. Everyone knew what it meant. They stood a little straighter, tightened their grip on their weapons, and let the Wurda carry them the rest of the way home. Okay. I am slouching. Totally not cool. Okay. Into the mountain's heart. Tanaga System, Northern Mountains. Durza Estate Hangar. The Wurda descended through the darkness beneath her cloak, little more than a controlled absence slipping between the mountain peaks. Outside the hull, the northern ranges of Tanagas The northern ranges of Tanagas rose from the night, the ridgelines wrapped in mist and moonshadow. The mountain winds swept across stone faces and forested slopes, but inside the freighter only the faintest tremor of atmospheric thrusters hinted at their passage. Ethan remained in the cockpit, his hands light on the controls as his eyes moved between the approach vectors and the encrypted overlays streaming from the writ of Ghostfire. He had flown this route countless times and knew every ridge, approach vector, and dead angle hidden within the mountains surrounding them. Under ordinary circumstances, he would have made the descent half asleep. Tonight was far from ordinary. Marin rested in the hold beneath Emberlock authority while the galaxy believed that she was dead, and there was no room for complacency. Behind him, the Marines had already moved into position. Greer stood with an easy, squared stance in the forward section of the hold, his helmet clipped at his belt and his gray eyes sweeping the escort. Harris methodically checked the sling on his rifle again, adjusting the tension until it sat flush across his chest. Ral checked the seal on his belt pouch with quiet precision, his movements economical in practice. Vec ran one last diagnostic on the pod's antigrav, and then glanced once over his shoulder at Jared. Talon occupied the rear interior angle of the formation where he could watch the hatch, the corridor transition, and the escort spacing without interfering with the Greer's command of the deck. He hadn't spoken much during the journey. He rarely needed to. His presence carried its own reassurance, and like Greer, he understood recovery operations well enough to recognize when silence served the mission better than conversation. Jared hadn't moved far from the pod since they'd left Cure. He stood at its right flank now, one hand resting lightly on the smooth, unmarked durasteel. I know, I'm slouching. I know. I know. I know I'm slouching. No indicators or seams were visible unless someone knew precisely where to look. To anyone lacking clearance, it was little more than a secured transport container. To Jared, it was Marin. His stance was not aggressive, but it carried weight. One shoulder angled subtly toward the hatch, placing himself between the pod and any threat that might somehow reach it before they reached the estate. Greer's gaze passed over Jared briefly before returning to his marines. His left hand lifted slightly as two fingers brushed diagonally across his belt again, and then settled vertically against his thigh. Twin-edge shift. Nothing changes just because we're home. Transition to Ash escort. Harris and Raoul answered in kind. Harris brushed two fingers briefly along his temple as if clearing sweat, and then his hand dropped naturally toward the pod. Eyes on. Responsibilities are acknowledged. Raoul's motion was slower and deliberate as his thumb brushed once along the side of his index finger while his hand remained low and still. Silence maintained. No unnecessary discussion. 30 seconds to bay. Ethan's voice carried back to them, even and steady. We go in clean. Greer, you've got the deck. Copy, Greer answered, without looking toward the cockpit. His voice stayed low, more for tone than secrecy. Raoul, rear left. Harris, rear right. Vec, you're on the pod. Callista, stay close to him. Jared, stay close to the pod. No one breaks the perimeter. Talon shifted slightly at the rear interior angle, accepting the unspoken portion of the formation. He would watch the transition space and keep the escort's interior covered, closing any gaps that opened between the hangar and the corridor beyond. Jared's blue eyes met Greer's, and he dipped his chin once. You'll have to move me to make that happen. The corner of Greer's mouth lifted faintly. It was not quite a smile, but it was agreement enough. The word had touched down in the mutton hangar with a muted shudder, her inertial dampener swallowing the last of the descent. There were no visible sentries. There did not need to be. The security here was built into the walls themselves, with sensor arcs, concealed systems, and blast doors layered into the stone itself. Beyond the lowering ramp, the hangar waited in shadowed steel and carved rock, the air still and cold without the wind from outside. The ramp lowered. Greer's hand settled briefly against the pod, and his fingers tightened once before falling away. Ash, escort. We're not done yet. Callista took her place behind Vec and just off the pod's rear, close enough to reach the controls or seal assembly if the medical systems required it, but far enough back to not interfere with Vec's guidance. Her presence completed the formation in a way none of them needed to discuss. Talon monitored the interior transition and reinforced the formation where the route narrowed. Jared held the rear guard behind Vec and Callista, watching the angles no one else could afford to look toward. Greer took the lead, his boots striking the Durasteel deck with the soft, deliberate rhythm of a man who knew sound carried differently underground. The pod floated between them on silent repulsors as Jared matched his pace at the rear, its attention divided between the landing pad and the route behind them. Harris and Raoul bracketed the formation on either side, with their rifles angled down but ready. Talon moved just inside the rear arc, watching the hatch behind them and the entrance to the corridor ahead. Raoul's gaze swept the overhead catwalks once, and then the shadowed entrance of the corridor ahead. The edge of his right palm brushed once along his thigh as if clearing dust before settling. Path clear. It's safe enough to continue. They crossed the hangar without a word. The only sounds were the soft hum of the anti-grav and the quiet footfalls of the escort. At the inner blast doors, Greer placed his hand against the security plate. The sensor recognized him, and the heavy door slid aside, revealing the short transit corridor into the estate itself. Stone walls were reinforced with Durasteel beams and waited beyond, the dim sconces threw long shadows along the floor. The escort moved through without slowing. Once they were inside, the doors closed behind them with a deep, resonant thud. The air changed immediately. It was warmer now and scented faintly with wood, polished timber, and something sharper from the inner hearth fires. The mountain now stood between Marin and the rest of the galaxy, and only then did some of the tension ease. Greer glanced toward Jared. Once we're in the inner hall, he said quietly. We seal the Emberlock room and post a rotation. No change to standard veil rotation. Jared nodded. She won't wake up in the pod. She won't have to, Greer answered. and then 2 fingers brushed diagonally across his belt before settling vertically against his thigh and relaxed. Shift to internal posture, estate rules in effect. The signal passed through the escort, one acknowledgement at a time. Harris, Ral, Vec, Talon, and Jared each received it without breaking formation. Together they moved deeper into the estate, carrying their burden through stone and silence while the mountain closed around them. Oh, I need water. I know, I'm totally slouching. Totally slouching. Where silence keeps vigil. The stone corridor seemed to swallow sound, each footfall dulled by the woven runners laid along the central passage. The pod's repulsors whispered as they guided it forward through the mountain, Vec guiding the transport frame with steady hands while Callista remained close enough behind him to intervene, if required. Jared's attention moved between the pod, the corridor, and the people around it, his hand never straying far from his saber whenever the formation slowed. Sorry. Greer walked a pace off the pod's front edge, his gaze sweeping ahead with the practiced awareness of a Marine senior non-commissioned officer who had spent too many years escorting wounded personnel through uncertain territory to mistake familiarity for safety. Behind them, Talon maintained the rear of the formation in disciplined silence, his helmet clipped to his belt and his rifle slung but ready, every piece of equipment secured for movement. Ethan remained above in the estate control room, allowing Greer to retain operational control of the escort until Marin was safely settled. Okay. The Emberlock chamber lay deeper within the mountain than most visitors to the estate ever realized. The reinforced doors that opened before them bore no markings, no sigils, and no outward indication of their purpose. They were simply part of the mountain, concealed behind layers of stone and security that discouraged curiosity. As the pod crossed the threshold, the atmosphere changed. The chamber beyond was quiet in a way few places ever truly were. Its shielded walls muting outside interference and its lighting softened to a warm golden glow. Against the far wall stood the bed Callista had ordered to be prepared before they left for Catane. It was a solid wooden frame that Jerry Esтерza had carved by hand decades before, shaped from mountain ironwood and finished with the same patience he had brought to every craft worth doing properly. Folded katani blankets rested at its foot, their teal and deep gray threads catching the light, while the quilt Callista had spread across the mattress waited. Greer slowed the formation once they were fully inside. His hands remained low as his palms angled outward near his belt and his stance widened, placing himself between the chamber and the door without obstructing the path of the pod. Perimeter seal. The chamber is now protected. Harris and Ral split immediately to check the chamber's inner corners, sweeping each recess with practiced care before nodding in turn. Vec released the pod into their care and took the threshold watch, his stance square and his eyes already tracking the corridor beyond. Talon remained slightly inside, occupying a position that allowed him to observe both the door and the pod without blocking anyone's movement. Nothing in his posture suggested tension, but his attention never truly relaxed. Jared shifted closer to the pod as Greer turned toward him. For the first time since entering the chamber, Greer looked directly at him rather than through him. The Marine's hand settled briefly at waist level, and his knuckles met once in a contained, grounded contact before separating. Double anchor. Your call. Jared's throat tightened. He looked once at the bed, at the familiar lines of Jarius' handiwork, and then back at the pod that had carried Marin through fire, silence, and the void. When he spoke, his voice was low and deliberate. Let's move her to the bed. Greer held his gaze for a long beat, and then gave the slightest nod. It was approval, permission, and understanding bound together in a single movement. Ral, Harris, lift and brace. Jared, you take her shoulders. The Marines moved without hesitation. Harris disengaged the transport locks while Ral took position on the opposite side of the cradle. Greer moved to the primary control and entered the release sequence. The pod answered with a muted series of clicks, followed by a soft hiss as the upper shell separated along nearly invisible seams and began to open. No one spoke as the chamber lights revealed Marin's shrouded form within. The Emberlock shroud still covered her, its insulated layers sealed at the from the top of her head to her toes. The shroud and the pod had protected her through the journey, maintaining temperature, shielding her from unnecessary stimulation and scanning, and securing her against movement. Even now, resting within the opened pod beneath the chamber's light, she seemed separated from the room by layers of fabric, protocol, and necessity. Sorry. Callista stepped forward immediately. She had watched the opening sequence without interruption, her attention fixed on the shroud rather than the pod itself. Once the shell had fully lifted, she moved to Marin's side and rested one hand against the shroud where it covered the curve of Marin's shoulder. "The seals are still engaged," she said quietly. "Give me a moment." Her fingers moved with a practiced precision across the seals hidden along the shroud's edges. One seal disengaged, then another, and another, each releasing with a faint hiss that was almost lost beneath the chamber's ambient silence. No one rushed her. The final seal was released, and Callista carefully folded the upper layers back. Marin's face emerged first, pale and still, and lines of exhaustion covered her face beyond anything sleep alone could repair. Yet she was undeniably alive. Something shifted in the room. It was not relief, but quieter than that. A shared confirmation that the impossible part of the journey had held long enough to bring her home. Jared drew a slow breath. Greer's shoulders eased slightly. Talon's gaze lingered for a moment longer than it had before, and then returned to his watch. "Easy now," Callista murmured. Though whether she was speaking to Marin or the people surrounding her was impossible to tell. Together they lifted her. Harris and Rel supported the shroud while Jared guided her shoulders and Greer controlled the transfer from the pod. Their movement remained careful and deliberate, every adjustment coordinated through experience rather than discussion. Marin never stirred. When they settled her onto the bed, the contrast struck all of them. The hard lines of the pod against the warmth of the bed, the steel of Emberlock against the familiar craftsmanship of Jers's hands. Callista immediately drew the quilt upward and settled it around Marin's shoulders, gently, adjusting blankets and pillows until she was satisfied. The pod's armor had given way to woven wool, and the chamber's warm, shielded quiet. The severity of Emberlock had not disappeared, but it had been softened by care, stitched in silence. We have an ad starting in about 10 seconds, my friends, so I'm gonna pop us over to BRB. Go get yourself some water, because I need to do that. Welcome back from the ads, my friends. Hey, Joe, thank you for the gifted sub. I didn't see who it went to. I appreciate you. Ethan stepped through the door a moment later and stopped just inside the threshold. His gaze moved from the open pod to the bed and finally settled on Marin herself. For several seconds, he said nothing, and then he looked toward Greer, Jared, Harris, Ralph, Vec, Talon, and finally Callista. "You've done right," he said quietly, his words carrying through the chamber. No one answered because no answer was needed. Jared lowered himself carefully into a chair beside the bed, one hand resting against the wooden frame Jarius had built so many years before. Callista remained nearby, the shawl's silver thread glinting in the low light where she held it loose in her arms. The Marine settled naturally into the first rotation of what would become a long watch. Harris and Rowell shifted to exterior patrols along the corridor and surrounding access routes. Talon took the watch inside, standing where he could see Marin, the entrance, and the chamber's shielded interior without intruding on the people near the bed. Sorry. Callista moved quietly, the shawl slipping from her arms to rest along the back of the carved chair by the bed. Her fingers, which were often so steady in battle, softened when they touched Marin's wrist. She drew a small med scanner from her belt pouch, but even as it hummed to life, she leaned close and pressed 2 fingers to the pulse point herself. Old habits, learned long before the machines, still had their place. "Steady," she murmured, her voice low, almost for herself. Thready, but steady. Jared leaned forward from his seat near the bed, his eyes fixed on Marin's face. "Her color is better than when I saw her after Collier. She doesn't look—" He trailed off, his jaw working as though the words themselves had caught in his throat. Callista glanced at him once, sharply, but not unkind. "She doesn't look gone," she finished for him, letting the blunt truth anchor them both. Greer stood near the door, his arms folded over his chestplate, but his gaze never left the chamber's heart. "Vitals?" His tone was clipped and professional, though something weightier than the request moved beneath it. Callista studied the scanner again and then slid it onto the table, trusting her instincts as much as the readout. "Pulse is weak, but it's holding. Her breathing's shallow. She'll need fluids, warmth, and time. Her body's been through Daryaim." She adjusted the blanket, tucking it closer around Marin's shoulders, her hand lingering a moment in a small, motherly gesture. Jared's hand gripped the carved edge of the bed, his knuckles pale against the dark grain. Sorry. "Time," he echoed, his voice thick with something close to defiance. "She'll have it. She won't wake up to steel walls and sterile lights. Instead, she'll wake up here." Callista's eyes softened, and for the moment the stern lines of her face eased. "You did the right thing, Jared, bringing her here instead of leaving her in the pod." She touched the edge of the quilt, smoothing the embroidered shawl where it lay within reach, the silver threads glinting. "She'll feel this, even if she doesn't know why." Ethan had been silent again, standing in the shadow of the chamber's threshold. Now he stepped forward, his boots sounding heavily against the stone. He stopped at the foot of the bed, his gaze fixed on Marin as if he could anchor her spirit by sheer will. "She fought to get this far," he said at last, his voice low and even. "We'll fight to keep her here." Greer shifted slightly, his posture easing. Perimeters locked down. Vex at the threshold, Harris and Rao will run rotations outside. Talon's on the inner watch. Nothing gets past without my say-so. His eyes flicked to Ethan and then to Callista. "She's under better care than any Marine infirmary could give." Callista gave a small, weary nod. "Better than most med wards, too." She pulled the shawl gently from the chair and laid it across Marin's upper chest, smoothing it flat. The Lahea Torin pattern shimmered faintly in the light. The chamber fell into stillness again. broken only by the hum of shielded walls and the faint rhythm of Marin's breathing. Jared bowed his head, his hands still braced against the bed frame as though grounding both himself and her. Callista kept her hand near Marin's wrist, steady and watchful, while Talon held the watch with quiet discipline. Greer stood near the door, and Ethan lingered for a moment at the edge, then their silence carrying what words could not. Sorry. Threads of light. The mountain kept its own counsel. Stone pressed a hush into the room that felt almost sacred, the air faint with cedar oil, wool, and the dry sweetness of sun-warmed stone. Along the north wall, the sealed pod sat locked into its cradle, the matte shell swallowing the lamplight. There were no windows, no readouts. On the bed Jarius had built, joints pegged with care, a maker's sigil hidden on the underside of the rail, Marin lay beneath layers of blankets, the soft-spun katani weave she'd favored as a child, and the heavier soldier's blanket broken in with use, and over it all, Callista's quilt. At her shoulders, the shawl had settled, its border embroidered with the Lahey-Torin pattern. Callista stood at the bedside and let her breathing quiet until the room's long silence steadied. The healer's cuff was cool against Marin's wrist, a discreet loop with no broadcast. It only relied on skin contact to track pulse and temperature and the shallow breath. She let her eyes close and allowed her awareness to slip down through the surface sensations toward the place the force gathered. The force manifested itself in threads, as it always had with Marin. Some strands were steady, anchor lines that held even under a storm. Some were frayed, their ends scorched, vibrating with memory. Some threads belonged to the present, some belonged to old wounds. Others ran backward through years of choices and trials. Here, there was a thin, bright cord that ran clean back to the forests of Gatan. Wintergreen, the salt of sweat, the heavy, cooling warmth of a wolfhound carried over her shoulder. 4 at minimum, Master Zane had said. They had brought 5. Callista watched the memory rise and fall. Marin, 12 and too stubborn to give her body the concessions it asked for. She was still healing from Ethan's trial and from the cord or ambush that had left tenderness along her ribs and a crusting bruise across one shoulder. Jared, Bran, Koya, and Davet, 4 shadows flanking her smaller one, sure-footed over leaf duff and roots. Jared had taken the bulk of the weight, as older boys do when they decide you're one of theirs. Marin had refused the empty-handed grace and carried her quarry anyway. Her jaw set, her blue eyes alight with something that was not defiant as much as an oath. A faint hitch in Marin's breath rippled through Callista's fingers. She softened her focus and laid the gentlest pressure where the pattern shivered. Along the edges scorched by the sonics, the thin fissures force lightning leaves and more than flesh. Her healer's touch was a tide held back and then allowed to seep in, cool, measured, and almost impersonal in its restraint. She would not overrun the banks. The body knew what it needed. Her temperature holds, Callista murmured, her voice calibrated to the calm in the room. Her respiration is steady. The trance is settling deeper. Across the bed, Jared had taken a seat on the other chair, back to the wall, his knees drawn up and his hands folded loosely. Here, the ritual was different. Presence itself was the touch. On the wall behind him hung Jarius's old field cloak, oiled and kept ready. The scent of it was cedar oil and iron and rain. Jared's gaze flicked once to the sealed pod against the wall, and then returned to Marin's face, where the trance had smoothed the pain's small telltales, the lines at her mouth, the angle of her brow, and the reflexive tightening in her throat when distant thunder rolled through memory. He spoke softly without looking away. "How deep do you want her?" His words were careful. "Here, Callista said, and she could hear the choice more than the word. And he could hear the choice more than the word. Where the body repairs and the mind is held but not smothered. I'll lengthen the intervals, but not the weight of it. Jared nodded once. Outside, Vex's boots passed and paused, the cadence of a man who'd learned to be audible just enough to be known, and inaudible where needed. Farther off, a faint sensor thrum shivered through the stone, Harris and Rel rotating on the perimeter. They had met Jared first on the day the Werda came home from Bastine, her hull still hot, and the grief still raw. He could still see the way Harris had stepped forward then, 2 fingers resting on the rail, a touch that was both oath and apology. They had not left her watch since. Jared let his head tip back against the wall and closed his eyes. Behind his eyelids he saw the forests, not as Marin saw them, but as a boy who had followed her into them under trial in spring and sky. 5 wolfhounds. He'd carried 1, Koya 1, Bran 1, and Davit limping but grinning with the 5th because Marin had insisted he not be the one to come in empty-handed as she carried her own. He'd watched her cross the last ravine with the weight of the day tucked under her shoulders and the set of her mouth. He'd said nothing then, and he said nothing now. She won't like this part, he said, finally, a shade of dryness braided with the ache in his voice, staying centered, not swinging a blade. Then we'll do what we are good at, Callista answered, a small smile in her words. We anchor her where she doesn't want to stand until she remembers that she built that ground herself. The cuff hummed once, a contented sound, and Callista's eyes opened. She adjusted the shawl at Marin's collarbones, her fingers smoothing the pattern. The return of brightness along a path that had learned darkness intimately and chosen stubbornly to walk back anyway. She was angry that day, Callista said, the memory drawing a line through the years. Not at the trial. At the idea that pain should choose her radius, she refused to let it. Jared's mouth twitched. Hasn't changed. No, Callista said, but she's learned to let us stand within that radius with her. She let the thoughts settle between them. I didn't meet her until just before Zan sent you into the forest. She was all sharp edges then, like a blade held flat to the light. The attack in the corridor hadn't broken her, but it had clarified her edges. I remember thinking, this one will grow by choosing, not by being chosen. Jared breathed out through his nose. The sound of a laugh kept on a short leash. Zan knew what he was doing. Zan always did. So did Ethan, though sometimes he pretended otherwise. At Ethan's name, something lifted and eased in the room like a shoulder unnodding. Down the corridor, beyond stone and closed doors, Callista could feel him moving through plans in the war room with Greer. Lines, counters, ambush berms, and mines tucked into fern beds where deer trails never ran. The patient combing of a hunter who knew the ground better than any map. The future hummed with the bright, dangerous focus of work that was worth the risk. Callista returned to the present. This pulse, this breath. She laid her palm lightly above the blanket at Marin's sternum, feeling for the rhythm that was not heartbeat, but pattern. The force was muted brass now, not raw like before. Where it caught, she eased it. Where it pulled, she guided it, and where it thinned, she let it thin and rest. She'll wake to quiet, Callista said at last. Not to planning. Good, Jared's eyes opened, and when she wakes, she'll try to stand. Then we'll put a chair exactly where she needs it, Callista said, amused and utterly resolved. Greer will build her a repeater plot in the war room. She can see every line, hear what she's allowed to, and command without stepping into the field she hasn't the blood to spend on. Jared absorbed that quietly. She'll bargain. And we'll bargain back. Callista's hand lifted the blanket, hovered, and then finally withdrew. I'll put her back together. Not all at once. Let the body present its invoice in smaller sums. A soft knock sounded 2, then 1. Vex cadence. Callista went to the door and cracked it. He didn't try to look past her. He never did. The perimeter holds, he said. The mountain put a weight on his words, making them heavier. No heat, no bleed. Thank you, she said, and he inclined his head, gone again in the measured way of men who prefer to leave no air disturbed, when they don't have to. Callista crossed back to the bed. Jared had shifted forward, his forearms braced on his knees. On the low table beside him lay the small case IT had sent with them from the yards. Jared's fingers touched the lid once, and then again, reverent despite himself, not to open it. He had already taken what he needed from it earlier. The weight of old metal against his palm, the cool oval of Jerry's tags, skin warm now from where he'd held them while the warder went dark and silent under cloak. He'd not give them to her until she asked. Rest, Callista said, touching his shoulder, healer and aunt in a single touch. You were up for too long. He started to refuse and then let it die. Wake me if... I will. Her mouth softened, but if is not tonight's word. He allowed himself a long breath, a longer exhale, and stood from the chair before he eased down the wall until he found the spot where the stone accepted his weight. He didn't close his eyes all the way. He never did, not when she slept. But the lines around them softened, and when his head tipped forward, it did so toward the bed, as if his body too understood where it meant to keep watch. Callista settled into the carved chair beside the bed. She kept the readout on local only and the force work small and precise. Outside the room, the estate breathed. Ethan's tread returning, pausing and moving on, Vex rotation sighing by like a tide. And in the quilt's quiet geometry and the shawl's stitch return, and in the slow cadence of Marin's breath, a girl who had once insisted on carrying more than she was asked to, began, thread by thread, to be carried back. Oops, sorry. Okay. One day your armor will not be for you. It will be for the one who walks behind you. Durza Creed, Maxim 21. There comes a moment when strength is no longer measured by how hard you can strike, but by how steadily you can stand between danger and someone who cannot. Armor stops being a shield for yourself and becomes a promise, worn for another's sake. Protection here is not an order or a tactic. It is a choice made over and over until the one behind you is safe enough to breathe again. And that, my friends, is chapter 23. Alright. Hope you all enjoyed the chapter this evening. It was a bit more intense than I was expecting. Even considering the lack of dialogue. But I hope you all enjoyed it. I will be live again a week from today with Stray at 7 p.m. Eastern. I had to think a second. It's been a little bit since I played Stray, so... let's see. Stitch Doll, hello, lady. Good to see you. I just finished reading my chapter. All right. Let's see. You know what? We're gonna go say hi to Don Polione, who is a fellow member of the Survivor Squad. He is currently playing Overwatch. I haven't actually played that, but he is a fellow member of our Survivor Squad, and we're gonna go show him some love. Thank you all for being here this evening. I greatly appreciate you. I hope the rest of your evening is calm and that you leave here with something good to carry forward. Please take care of yourselves, rest well, and I will see you next week. Hang around for the raid, please. Give me just a moment. Hope you guys have an awesome rest of your evening, and hope the rest of your week goes by quickly. It is Wednesday, hump day, so that means there's 2 days left in the week. I don't know about you, but I'm really looking forward to this weekend. So, alright, my friends. Let's get going. Have an awesome evening. Please take care of yourselves.